It might go without saying that 2022 has been a great year for horror fans, with the release of instant classics like Nope, Barbarian, X, and hell, even Marvel's Werewolf by Night. In fact, one could go so far as to say that the past 10 years in particular has seen a massive boom when it comes to horror in the mainstream media. But perhaps even more so, we have seen a huge rise in the subgenre of folk horror, which gets its name and origins from the word folklore. This video and indeed channel will be exploring different folklore tropes represented in horror and their origin. But to do that, we need to go back in time and understand where it all began. Like I mentioned earlier, the origin of folklore as a subgenre comes from folklore, and before we delve deeper into how folklore itself is represented in the type of horror we see today, we need to break down its definition. Merriam-Webster defines folklore as traditional customs, tales, sayings, dances, or art forms preserved among a people. In this case, a people means a culture. This is a very broad definition, so let's take it one step further. Oral storytelling tradition has been a part of human culture for thousands of years. These stories are used as a way to pass down core values and character traits that we consider important, and many of these still play a crucial role in today's society, though the stories themselves and the way that we tell them have changed and evolved over time. Folklore in terms of scary stories have been around since literally the Roman times, but back then the ghosts weren't necessarily evil as they're often depicted today. However, it wasn't until the late 18th century with the increased popularity of Gothic fiction that these type of stories and figures became much more menacing in the way that we are familiar with now. Stories like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and even Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol often feature dark and terrifying specters that are used to warn the protagonist of ill tidings and consequences if they do not change their ways. Prior to the invention of the motion picture in the late 19th century, folklore was passed on through either the written word, stage adaptations, or singing and dancing, as well as other art forms. But the ability to capture stories through filmmaking gave way for an entirely new way of exploring the morals that we already know so well. Filmmaking as an art form manages to connect with its audience and keep them engaged by relating to our emotions, and thus leaving a very vivid impression that often stays with us, sometimes even for the rest of our lives. And it's almost impossible to talk about the origin of folklore and horror without discussing the 1973 classic The Wicker Man. And no, I don't mean the 2006 abomination with Nicolas Cage. I'm talking about the Wicker Man written by Anthony Shaffer and directed by Robin Hardy, starring the late Sir Christopher Lee. For those unfamiliar with the premise, The Wicker Man follows the story of Sergeant Howie, who travels to Summer Isle in the Scottish Hebrides to find a missing child. It quickly turns out that nothing on the island is quite as it seems, and Howie soon finds himself in the middle of what appears to be a pagan commune, relying on the teaching of an ancient religion rather than the devout Christianity that Howie practices. It becomes clear very early on that the islanders know the truth about the missing child, but are purposely keeping it from Howie and keep telling him that there's nothing for him to be worried about. This effectively adds to the ongoing gaslighting of Howie and eventually alters his perception of the reality he knows, making him question everything around him. It's important to mention The Wicker Man because even though it wasn't the first horror movie to use folklore, in its storytelling, it became significant in how later filmmakers explored different aspects of folklore tropes in their films. Perhaps none more obvious than Ari Aster, whose 2019 folk horror hit Midsummer was heavily influenced by The Wicker Man. There's a few themes to be explored in The Wicker Man, but perhaps more than deception, one could argue that a more important theme in the film is that of isolation, which again becomes a near constant feature of later films in the same genre. The real horror is Sergeant Howie's slow realization that he's all alone out on Summer Isle without any means of contacting anyone on the mainland, and it becomes even more frightening without the use of modern technology such as cell phones and the internet. What makes The Wicker Man particularly scary, though, at least to me, is the idea that something so seemingly familiar can also be so uncanny. It goes back to the fear of the other, which also is as old as time itself. But The Wicker Man also gave birth to the idea of an alternate Britain, which is filled with these small communities with their own customs and secrets that outsiders are not allowed to partake in. The whole time we see a man pit his most earnest convictions in both the rule of law and the rule of God against a culture that seems absurd to him and almost primitive, yet is somehow always perpetually 3 steps ahead. And they have so much fun breaking him down and mocking him that it's almost as if they're hardly trying. It calls into question how and why we choose to value the things we do in the first place, and whether we've chosen correctly at all. A lot of societal norms found in folklore that we still deem important today stem from old Christian teachings, and The Wicker Man was one of the first horror films to use paganism, in this case specifically British paganism, as an allegory for evil and something that openly challenged the beliefs that Sergeant Howie holds so dear. Whether or not you think The Wicker Man is a scary film at all comes down to personal taste, but I think we can all argue that this is one of those movies that really paved the way for how we use folklore in modern horror. Have you seen The Wicker Man? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked the video and would like to see more explorations of folklore and horror, please click the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.